So we'll start with a quick poll. If you could all just click on that link. Does your agency currently have a language access plan? Your options are yes, no, we are working on it. And if you're not sure or you don't know, not sure would be the best option. Just to get an idea of your level of knowledge and experience with language access plan. 29% of you have an access plan. 29% are not sure. 21% said no, and another 21% we are working on it. Okay, we can move on to the next slide.
All right, so before we dive right in, we're going to go over some common terminology just to make sure we're all on the same page, since it looks like we're pretty evenly split on whether we do already have a language access plan, we're working on it, we're not sure, or we don't. So when we talk about language access, what we mean are the rights of individuals with limited English proficiency to receive meaningful access to federally funded state and federal programs. When we refer to limited English proficient, that's what we mean referring to individuals who do not speak English as their primary language and have a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. So you'll see the acronym LEP in referral to those individuals. When we talk about interpretation, what we mean is the conveying of information orally from one language to another. So interpreting during an interview, for instance. And when we talk about translation, what we're meaning is the conveyal of information in writing from one language to another. So translating documents and things like that. All right. Ikram.
I'm sorry, I was speaking while on mute, sorry. So if you're unfamiliar with language access plan, the process of creating one can sound a bit overwhelming, but we interact with and work with institutions that have language access or that provide language access services all the time. A good example is the medical field. A language access plan traditionally is used as guides on how to provide services to individuals who are non-English speaking or have limited English proficiency, as Traci mentioned. However, it should be inclusive and should include deaf and hard of hearing clients, LGBTQIA, youth, and elder clients. It's unique and tailored to individual organizations. So it's not a copy and paste from one organization to the other, as our services differ and our populations that we provide services may differ. It requires commitment. It's an ongoing commitment. It evolves and grows with your organization. So as language evolves, and so does your plan. It includes both translation and interpretation services. However, those are not the only components to creating a language access plan. Okay, we can go on the next slide. So why is it important to have a language access plan? In the world of advocacy, we acknowledge the importance of accessibility. So number one reason is to provide services that are accessible, easily accessible to the populations that we believe may not have access or difficult accessing services. It also ensures your organization provides high quality and effective services. It encourages clients, victim survivors to participate fully as they advocate for themselves through domestic violence and sexual violence and the legal system. Okay, next slide.
One of the questions that we get asked a lot is, well, what if those communities aren't accessing our services? Because sometimes there are people that we know of in our communities who aren't accessing our advocacy services. We want to hold ourselves accountable and ask an important question. Why is that? So I think the first step to figure out is who is in your community and not accessing services. Are you seeing youth? Are you seeing communities of color, immigrant or refugee populations, LGBTQ2SIA plus folks, folks with disabilities? And then from there, you need to ask yourself, well, what is your presence in those communities? Is your agency collaborating with community centers, faith-based centers, youth centers? Are your advocates accessible in spaces that people feel comfortable in? Are you advertising your services in corner stores or mercados? Local stores, bars, and restaurants are often willing to put up posters or leave materials out for customers to take. So it might take some creative outreach strategies to reach those who aren't currently accessing your services. And remember that it will take some time. But it's especially important to consider who may not be accessing your services, because often underserved populations are at disproportionate risk of experiencing violence.
In the next few slides, we will discuss the following components to consider as you think about and create and/or update your language access plan. We'll talk about phone services, in-person services, trainings, and now virtual trainings, online and print materials.
Great. So the first component that we are going to consider the first component of language access plans as you're creating or updating your plan is to consider the in-person services that you offer. So I think when we're thinking about in-person services, oftentimes we're maybe thinking about the communication we have as advocates with our clients. But in terms of accessibility, it's also really important to think about the physical space of your agency. And so some specific ideas to consider around that are things like making sure your agency does have a process for requesting physical accommodations for in-person services. Are clients able to request physical accommodations over a phone during an intake process? Are you advertising accommodations that are available on your website? Or are you ensuring that clients can make those requests via email or text prior to even coming to the physical location itself? And then I think ensuring the physical space where you're holding events is accessible for people with differing mobile access. And one way of doing this is really to tour the spaces that you're going to use in person if possible, just to get a feel for what is available to the clients that will be attending. Think about what sort of materials are visible in your space. Are they available in multiple languages? Are they available in visuals for folks who might not be able to read? And then last, I think, thinking about your agency's common space and meeting spaces. Are those spaces that you would feel comfortable talking with somebody about your trauma in? And this can look many different ways depending on the culture of your agency. Some agencies like to offer beverages to the clients that come in, candies or snacks. Other agencies have fidgets or stress relievers available. Some agencies have comfortable furniture, armchairs and couches versus regular office furniture. And so I think thinking about ways that you can make your agency space comfortable and accessible is just as important as thinking about the ways that we are communicating in accessible ways with our clients.
When thinking about creating the language access plan, your first audience to train our staff. So making sure that all employees understand the importance of providing assistance and are able to do so. It's important staff are aware of your language access plan policies and procedures. All staff should be able to access and know how to access interpretation or translation services. When providing training for the community or just outreach in general, for virtual training, how can you make your virtual training space more accessible? So thinking about how are people accessing links? Are they easy to navigate? Font size, if you're able to, I know some different services that provide virtual trainings can differ in what they offer, but taking advantage of those options just to make it easier for folks to find you and to take part in that training. Collaborating with other organizations to expand your reach if you're unable to provide a virtual space, as you envisioned, and just making sure all your trainings are accessible to the population that you're providing training to.
Okay, so when we're thinking about online guidelines to include in a language access plan, online guidelines can include many components: a website, your social media, blog posts. So it could encompass a number of things. And especially since COVID-19, agencies have had to really think about what their online presence looks like. And understanding how to make your online presence as accessible as possible can be complicated. Depending on what your agency uses, you might have several social media accounts. You likely have a website. Maybe you've moved to virtual platforms such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams for your trainings or your meetings with clients. And as we've switched over to using online platforms more frequently, one thing to check out are the compatibility features available for your clients when using systems like Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Skype. It's also important to make sure that all of your electronic materials are accessible to a screen reader and that you use what's known as alt text when you're posting images. So for those who might not be familiar with alt text, it's just a short description of the image that you're posting. So if I were to post an image of a rose, for instance, I would type the alt text rose so that somebody using a screen reader would be able to tell what the image is. And then when using images with people in them, you should review the images just to make sure that people with differing identities are represented. Additionally, you'll want to make sure that you have closed captioning on webinars that you do and videos that you post. And finally, it's important to consider the actual language you use on your website and in social media posts. Is it easily understandable? Are you using jargon that folks outside of advocacy won't understand? One example to consider was when I was doing prevention work with international students and talking with them about consent. It was really interesting for me to learn that the word consent doesn't really have a good translation in many of their native languages. So I had to think creatively about how I was explaining the concept of consent. In addition to paying attention to language that's inaccessible, the overall messaging that you're using must be stated at a reading level that native English speakers will also understand. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have very high rates of illiteracy. In fact, the Literacy Project reports that currently 45 million Americans are functionally illiterate and can't read above a 5th grade level. That 50% of adults cannot read a book written at an 8th grade level. 3 out of 5 people who are incarcerated can't read, and 3 out of 4 people who are receiving public benefits also can't read. So as you're thinking about clients that might be accessing your services, you need to think about how your language that you're using is accessible to those who may not be able to read at a high level. And then last but not least, you want to ensure that your contact information is visible on your website or your social media, and that there are multiple ways an individual can contact your agent.
So pro materials can mean everyday forms, the confidentiality form, brochures, the power and control wheel, translating documents, on intakes, screening forms in general. That will make it much easier for clients that are not, that have limited English speaking proficiency to fully participate in their own self-advocacy. So brochures are really helpful because that's where all the information is. And if you can't do several languages, focusing on the bigger languages. There's tons of smaller communities all over Minnesota. And then the power and control wheel. So I have an experience with that where if you just Google power and control and then, fill in whatever blanket you're looking for, it's not going to directly translate what you're trying to translate from the English power and control wheel. As Traci mentioned, one word in English may not directly translate to another word, let's say in Arabic. So making sure that you have experts looking at it and that it's communicating and translating exactly what you're trying to communicate on that. And confidentiality form is one that a lot of people run into. Translating that directly or interpreting that directly you may not have access to that all the time. So having a copy translated is really helpful as well. Okay, so I'll spend some time talking about Minnesota statutes, the importance of having a court-appointed interpreter. So pre-state policy, anybody that has limited English proficiency has the right to a court-appointed interpreter. That does not mean family member or friend. They have the right to request an interpreter at any point in the proceeding. So making sure clients know that that's the right that they have. They don't have to continue in a language they don't understand. And I'll just read quickly what I grabbed from the website. If you speak limited if you speak limited or no English and are a party to a case, you have the right to a court-appointed interpreter during the court proceedings at no cost to you. There is a website there that you can visit for more additional information. And law enforcement agencies are not required to have a written language access plan. They are still subject to non-discrimination laws pre the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You can remind law enforcement, however, about the access to language line. So victim survivors know that they can still report a crime, but they can request an interpreter to be on the line with them, or they can take family members with them. I wouldn't recommend that, but they do have that right to ask for the access to language line. Sorry, next.
Okay, just to share a little bit of additional history, when Ikram and I were doing a little research into the laws around language access plans, I discovered that in August 2000, the president signed an executive order 13166, on improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. And the executive order required federal agencies to examine the services they provide, identify the needs for services to those with limited English proficiency, and develop and implement a system to provide those services so that LEP individuals had meaningful access to them. The executive order also requires that the federal agencies work to ensure that recipients of federal financial assistance provided meaningful access to their LEP applicants and beneficiaries. And when I was going through some of the documents outlining the history of this particular executive order, I discovered that they had a lot of thought and planning put into determining how many folks in the United States were actually considered limited English proficient and what sort of budget each federal agency would need to ensure what they termed meaningful access. And then just because I was curious, I was like, well, can presidential executive orders be revoked? And what I found was once they're issued, they actually remain in force until they're canceled, revoked, adjudicated unlawful, or expire on their terms. So really at any time and point, a president might revoke or modify or make exceptions from an executive order. But from what I could tell, this particular executive order is still in place.
So we talked a lot about accessibility, and that's a word we hear a lot in the advocacy world, how to make things more accessible. First impressions. Sorry, let me just, so first impressions, does your website or office and the trainings that you provide indicate to folks that your services are accessible? And we talked about translating documents. How does your physical space or online space look like? Does it accurately reflect the services that you provide? A good example of first impressions is the I Speak campaign. Some of you might have seen it. I've seen it in banks where they have little stickers of whatever language or the languages that individual who's providing the service speak. Keep in mind, bilingual advocates cannot be a language access plan. You still need to have some sort of access plan. It's great to have bilingual staff, but they cannot be, you don't want to burden someone to be the only interpreter or translating documents. So thinking about your website, thinking about your physical office space. Another example is having the pride flag, just a sign of welcome that we do provide services to all types of communities. And then again, as I talked about, trainings.
Thanks, Ikram. So questions to ask or precautions to take as you are creating or updating your language access plan. You want to be thinking about translation apps. A lot of people in the general public will swear by things like Google Translate or apps that might be available on your phone. And the reality is, if you're going to be using translated materials, you really need to use a translation service and then make sure that it's reviewed by speakers who are native to that language. The same with interpretation services. Not all interpretation services provide the same quality of service. And so if you're using an interpreting service, you really want to do your research and make sure, one, that interpreting service is able to provide trauma-informed services, but also that they have the languages that your clients most need to access. And then thinking about accessibility needs when you're using things like a web-based chat or a text service, what accessibility needs are your clients what accessibility needs might your clients have, and then what particular compatibility options are available on those particular services. So we began developing our own language access plan by doing a needs assessment and then reviewing various templates that were available. And then from there, we talked about the various modes of service that we offer. So really what it came down to was in-person services, phone services, and virtual or online services. And then our final step was to incorporate an evaluation of our LAP annually to evolve with the changing needs of the communities that we serve. And I'd recommend that for all agencies is just to do a yearly evaluation. Take an assessment of who you're seeing in your agency, who you aren't seeing in your agency, in what ways can you make your services more accessible to folks. And for those who don't know where to get started, or maybe developing an LAP seems just really overwhelming and something that you might not have the capacity to do, there's a really great online template that we're going to walk through with you. So you just go right to this website and you'll see as Ikram is scrolling down, it talks a little bit about why we should have language access templates, but then at the bottom of the page, there's a link to start a new plan. And so Ikram, if you want to click on that and start walking folks through, that'd be great.
Okay. So it gives you step-by-step on how to get started, what to gather, things to start thinking about as you consider or creating this plan for your organization. I mentioned before, it's not a copy and paste. So it really is tailored to your organization, planning for the future. So I'll just go through step one, gather and commit. So this is, you're starting to think about how to create that access plan, write down what you already do to provide language access. Assessing where you can grow and strengthen your language access policies and practices, planning for the future. Talked about the examples, the I Speak campaign, cards and posters. That's one way to provide services. And then it does provide examples as well. So this is super helpful just to give you that guidance on how to get started.
And then Ikram, do you want to actually click on the language access plan template link?
Yep.
you'll see, folks, that you can actually download a template that you can fill in, which I thought was super helpful when I was starting to do the research on how do you actually create a language access plan from scratch. Right. And so it starts out by talking about the need to be connected to your mission, recognizing that providing meaningful language access really is a critical function of ensuring the safety and security of the survivors that we work with. And then it just literally has places where you can either copy and paste the language into your own policy documents, just kind of reviewing general policy statements. So sample language 1, sample language 2. So they give you a lot of different options depending on the type of agency that you are and the services that you're providing. So then it jumps into talking about the purpose and the authority of having a language access plan. And you'll see that in this particular template, it actually references some of those statutes that Ikram and I were talking about earlier. Sometimes folks like to see why we have language access plans in the first place. And the reality is we have them not only because they're good to have, but also because there are requirements that our agencies have them. And then depending on how you feel, you can put in whether or not you have a liaison to lead your organization's efforts. Standpoint chose to talk about our efforts as an entire team. So meaning that there's not one person on staff who's solely in charge of the language access plan, because we all work with different populations of clients. I think it's always a really good idea to include definitions in your language access plans. You'll notice that this particular template includes even more definitions than Ikram and I talked about today. Section 4 talks about procedures. And so this is kind of where we talk about, let's assess what services we're offering first, right? So for instance, having a point of contact for your crisis line. What are the accessibility tools and resources that you have available? So for instance, I like that the first one is crisis line. The expectations of staff are to identify the language spoken and then to connect with either bilingual staff or the interpreters, which it looks like they're using language line here, which I know many of us use. And I like that they're providing multiple options for this, right? So it goes back to what Ikram was talking about, not just relying solely on staff who are bilingual to provide those services, but actually making sure that you have an interpretation of service available to you. And then it goes into talking about things like one-on-one participant meetings, shelter services, if you offer shelter services. And so you'll notice that for each of these services, they have what are the expectations of your staff, and then what are the tools and the resources that you have available to make things accessible for your clients. Ram, do you want to talk about the next area?
Sure. So I talked about earlier identifying primary language, making sure that all staff has access to your language access plan, and they understand what their roles are when it comes to providing services. It's using the example of the ISP cards again as being, the best way to connect with victim survivors that are coming into your office. Identifying the needs and the languages that are spoken in the communities that you provide services to. It gives some sample languages as well. Again, you can definitely copy and paste. It goes into policy. So every agency is, who can interpret and who can't interpret. I know sometimes when you're doing a screening and there's a friend or a family member, always asking the clients if they're comfortable, but also having a policy in place of who you're not going to allow to interpret for a victim survivor if you don't have access to those services. Okay. Again, more language, sample languages, notification of language assistance services, how do you monitor effectiveness? And this is the part, you know, you have a language access plan, but you're, like I said, it's going to evolve and grow with your organization. So making sure that the services that you're providing are effective, and you're not, again, relying on one person or relying on one component to say, we do provide services and we provide it through here. So, and as Traci mentioned, you can download this and read it on your own. Earlier, I talked about community outreach and collaboration. This is always helpful if you have clients that, you know, you don't know how to assist because maybe you don't have those resources. Always collaborating and calling other agencies. And what does that look like in your language access plan? What does like outreach and collaboration look like? He's talked about staff training. It's really important that all staff is on board and on the same page and understands what the importance of the language access plan and what it is for. Sorry, I think that's the end of that sample. But yeah, this document is super helpful if you just want to get an idea how to get started. I can share the website on the chat box if I haven't already. Okay.
And I also noted for folks that we would send this out. The actual template will attach that with the materials that we send out for this webinar as well.
Yes. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, and then yep, so just the resources slide. So this resource slide includes the template that we just went over. The I Speak campaign, it actually has downloadable materials that you can use in your agency. And the I Speak campaign actually originated from the UK, but it's absolutely useful here as well in the United States. And then some of the other resources we put on here are resources that will help to explain the importance of having the language access plan, resources that delve into the various components. I know we talked about those in our presentation today, but honestly, as our services evolve to meet the changing needs of our clients, so too might the resources that we use to make sure that our services are accessible. And then with that concludes our webinar, unless Ikram, you have anything else to offer, and we'll just open it up for questions. And if folks don't have any questions, that's fine too. We can end a bit early for the day, but again, we'll send out the recording and the materials to all of the attendees, including the templates that we went through today. And then our YouTube video, or our video of today's webinar, will be posted on Standpoint's YouTube page. If you haven't checked that out, I'd encourage you to go over and take a look at Standpoint MN YouTube. And you can see all of our past webinars as well. There are a lot of great training topics out there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.